I'm Tony Szamboti. I'm a mechanical engineer from the Philadelphia area with over 20 years of experience in the aerospace industry, where I design structures for aircraft and spacecraft and support equipment. I started looking at the building collapses that occurred in New York City on September 11, 2001, after reading a paper from a BYU physics professor, Dr. Stephen Jones, where he discussed what seems to be huge amounts of molten metal found in the rubble of just the three buildings that collapsed. After reading Dr. Jones's paper, I was taken aback, obviously shocked, and decided I needed to look at this myself. And that started 4 years ago in early 2006. Since then, I've written several papers due to my own research on the subject, and I've come to the conclusion that what we've been told as to how these buildings did collapse is false. It's unfortunately not the way it occurred. And something I've done in the last few months was written up a series of 24 substantiatable points which show that the leaders of the NIST World Trade Center investigations were less than forthright in their analysis, and that they themselves should be investigated for this reason. I just want to briefly get into each one of these points. The first point is concerns the fact that NIST claims that World Trade Center 1, the collapse initiated due to the south exterior wall buckling. The report claims this was due to inward bowing of the exterior columns that they allege bowed inwardly due to sagging main floor trusses. And there's a good bit of concern there, because if you do your own analysis on these floor trusses, you find that they don't sag nearly as much as the NIST purports them to at the temperatures at 700 degrees centigrade. I've done an analysis on that, and they only sag a couple inches, and they're saying they're sagging 40+ inches. NIST did a testing with Underwriter Laboratories. They contracted with them as part of their report, and lo and behold, the trusses did not sag that much. And NIST sort of walked around that and claimed that the reason that the trusses didn't sag in the test was that they had fireproofing on them, and that the reason the ones in the tower would have sagged is that the fireproofing would have been knocked off. You need to bear in mind that the south wall was completely on the opposite side of where the aircraft impact occurred. So that in itself should lead one to sort of be concerned about that. It's very difficult to knock all that fireproofing off all the way on the other side of these over 70 yards wide buildings. And what NIST doesn't do, in addition to that, they try to say that these floor trusses would have caused them to sag, but there's a problem with it in the sense that you need about the weight that's on 12 trusses to cause them to sag that much. So what they do in their analysis is say that several disconnected, like 10 of them, 10 or 11 disconnected and put the load on one. But the problem there is then why wouldn't the bolts that connect them to the outside wall column fail if they have the load of 12 on that one? Why did all the earlier 11 fail, but this one didn't fail? There's sort of a dichotomy going on there. In addition to that, the NIST model could not get the wall to fail with natural inputs. They had to add a horizontal force on the columns to get them to buckle. So even in their model, it shows the sagging floor trusses could not cause it. They couldn't get it to happen with natural inputs. I think that's a very serious issue, and it shows a lack of engineering rigor. And the second point to be made is that the NIST report does not provide a technical analysis of the structural behavior of the building during the collapse itself. They stop their analysis where they say the south wall buckled. And then they depend on a professor, a civil engineering professor from Northwestern University, Dr. Zdeněk Bazant, who did an analysis where he claims a progressive collapse could collapse the building. But he starts his analysis after a one-story fall. So here we have a gap between this alleged south wall buckling. What isn't explained is the propagation across the rest of the building before it falls one story. Nobody explains that. That's completely left open in the NIST report. They have not explained it. And it's important to know that. The third point sort of ties in with that second point, and that in their analysis, NIST does show what the additional loads on other parts of the structure would be if the south wall had buckled. And they provide the additional loads on the east and west perimeter columns. The problem for their analysis is that these loads do not cause anywhere near a failure condition in those east and west perimeter wall columns. So that needs to be looked at itself. Again, this does not support their contention that this instability spread across this building. They just don't have any numbers that can support that. The fourth point covers something else that NIST does in their initiation analysis. They claim that the building tilted 8 degrees to the south towards this buckling south face and then began its descent. Many people have looked at this now, and NIST provides no analysis of their own, but individual researchers have shown, you can measure it, that the building tilted 1 degree at most prior to descending several stories. And only then did it tilt 8 degrees. So NIST is completely in error here and provides no analysis otherwise. Point 5 concerns Dr. Bazant's papers where he claims an amplified dynamic load would have occurred at impact. What many people don't realize is these buildings are built to handle several times the load above them. And in fact, in the towers, the central core had a factor of safety of 3-to-1 against gravity collapse, and the perimeter columns 5-to-1 when you were only considering gravity, because they also had to be designed for high wind loading and seismic loads. Well, there was no earthquakes and there was no high winds on September 11, 2001, so those perimeter columns could handle 5 times the load above them, and the core columns could handle 3 times the load above them. So that load above them, as you can see, had no chance to collapse the lower portion of the building, unless, and this is a big if, unless there was an impact with a deceleration. What happens there is the force is amplified, and it's amplified because the deceleration is many times the rate of gravity. What has to happen, though, and you heard me use the word deceleration, is that the impacting object has to decelerate. And when it decelerates, it loses velocity. Well, the drop of the upper section of the North Tower, or World Trade Center 1, has been measured by a large number of people now. There is no deceleration. Dr. Bazant never measured that. He just assumed that there was a deceleration and what he considered a very large jolt. A very powerful jolt is the way he termed it. The fact that there is no deceleration shows that there was no impulsive load or amplified load. Some people try to defend, apologists for the present official story try to defend this by saying that the building tilted. Well, as I explained in the point 4 just a few minutes ago, there is no large tilt prior to this building coming down straight for several stories. It's a very small tilt, if any. It comes down several stories and then tilts. So that point is refuted. Other people tried to say that the impacts on the outside of the wall would have somehow been attenuated. Well, there's demolitions done in France which use what we call the vernage technique, where they take out a couple floors worth of columns with hydraulics. They take the columns out and they let the upper section of the building drop 2 full floors. That's somewhere around 25 feet. It's a significant drop of a large mass. And you can measure it. And when it impacts the lower section, there's a very definitive, observable jolt, deceleration, and velocity loss. And you can see it in the graph. It is not there in the case of the North Tower. The next point, I discuss this claim that the upper section of each of the towers crushed the lower section. However, when you watch video closely, in the case of World Trade Center 1, you'll see that the upper section disintegrates itself. Its lower stories are breaking up before it even impacts the lower section. It appears to be a controlled demolition of its own of the upper section, and that would be done to generate momentum of that upper section before it contacts the lower section. Point 7 discusses the fact that NIST acknowledges in their response to a request for correction that they are unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. Yet they refused to consider the possibility that explosives or some other form of demolition device could have been used to cause the collapses of the towers. And the fact that controlled demolition is consistent with all the available technical evidence. The request for correction was filed by architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth and many others who simply don't believe that the collapse has been explained properly. And the response to that request for correction is NIST simply saying they're unable to provide a full explanation for the total collapse, even though that was their task given to them by Congress. Point 8, it concerns the NIST testing of the Twin Tower floor assemblies done at Underwriters Laboratories under contract to NIST. This was done per ASTM E119 in a 2-hour, 2,000-degree fire test. During the test, the main trusses sagged approximately 4 inches after 60 minutes and 6 inches after 100 minutes, which were the approximate durations of the fires in World Trade Center 1 and 2, or World Trade Center 2 and 1 respectively. Yet NIST had the main trusses sagging well over 40 inches in their models, where they had also removed the bridging trusses between the core and the perimeter. They didn't account for the effect of the bridging trusses being removed in their global model, even though they claimed they would earlier in the report. In addition to that, analysis of the main trusses showed a deflection of just 2 inches with their normal floor load at 700 degrees centigrade. To gain a sag over 40 inches, NIST claims that several main trusses were caused to disconnect from the exterior columns and then applied over 10 additional normal floor loads to the few remaining connected trusses. One is then left to wonder how the claim can be made that a few sagging trusses could pull in the entire perimeter wall or any large section of it, as the connection of these few remaining trusses to the perimeter wall would not have withstood this load. In other words, they're making the claim that all these other trusses disconnected so that they can overload this one, but they're saying it wouldn't disconnect. There's a dichotomy there in my mind. Point 9 discusses the fact that NIST owned testing for actual steel temperatures on the pieces they did get from the Twin Towers had experienced temperatures over 250 degrees centigrade, where steel has not lost any strength yet. And none had experienced temperatures beyond 600 degrees centigrade, where steel loses about half its strength. So bear in mind, less than 1.5% of the steel that NIST actually got showed that it experienced any temperatures where steel would actually lose strength. 98.5% of the steel they got showed it would not lose, it had not experienced temperatures where it would lose any strength at all. The areas the steel came from that NIST did their testing on came from, according to them, the fire-affected areas. Yet these members had not experienced high temperatures that would be expected in something that would have catastrophically collapsed. In fact, like I said earlier, they didn't experience temperatures that would cause them to lose strength in 98.5% of the cases. So it's hard to say how the structure actually lost strength. This steel was all selected from the areas that were affected by the jet fuel from the aircraft impacts and subsequent fires. This calculates what they call DCR, which is a demand to capacity ratio. Many people are familiar with the term factor of safety. The towers are built to withstand several times the load above them. If it was 3 times the load above them, the factor of safety would be 3 to 1. They do what they call the DCR, and that's actually reciprocal, where the demand would be, in that case, would be 1/3 of the capacity. It would be a factor of safety of 3 to 1 would be a DCR of 0.33. That means the demand was only 0.33 or 33% of the capacity. But what they do something I think that's disingenuous. When you design for a worst case scenario, you're putting the maximum possible loads on it. And that's not always what exists. That's what they determine their factor of safety or demand to capacity ratio from, the absolute worst case loads that the tower would ever experience. But that's not what was actually on those buildings. In fact, the demand that was on those buildings was probably about 2/3 or less than the worst case design load.